Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to view Multiplicity. So, beyond the great comedy of this film, because of course, Pete Mawala is pretty funny to a lot of people, we would of course state that this movie does have a very goofy concept, because it's basically a guy named Doug who really is burnt out and is burning the candle at both ends. But he obviously wants to become a very lazy person. To the point of Doug, who is to realize that everything is just kind of stacking against him. And so the way of which that he tries to resolve that is going on and cloning another one of him. And so it seems that all of a sudden when Doug is to realize that he can have time on his hands to do stuff that he's never gone on and done, which I would have assumed that would have been like, hey, I'm going to sleep in for a whole entire day. Hey, I'm going to go on and I'm going to just enjoy my couch. Because, man, do I need one of those kind of days. And so, we come to find Doug, who still is to find another part of his life that starts to complicate it, to where Doug cannot go on and go golfing or go on to go sailing. And so Doug then decides to clone himself for a second time, which would be 3 altogether. So, meaning that this would be the 3rd Doug. So, we now have Doug, who has one person that is taking care of his work life, and another clone that is to be taking his home life. And so, now Doug is to state, like, well, hey, I'm just going to go on and I'm going to leave. I'm going to just go on this boating trip and leave. And then the further and further that Doug is to start to take a break from his life, he starts to realize that maybe he's never going to go on and get his life back again. Or that he really is going to lose every bit of his life by the time that he gets back, because everything is just falling around him. Because we technically have Doug, who now is in certain small portions of his own life, and for any other Doug that is to try to substitute for any of those other parts, it just kind of fails. To where we really have Doug, who really needs to get back his life in its entirety and kind of let all these other clones that have kind of borrowed little portions of time, even to the point of them also getting burnt out and needing to clone another Doug, which would be now 4 clones, we start to then realize that Doug no longer needs any of these people. Or maybe at some point, Doug can go on and have one of the Dougs come back maybe at some time to help him out. Or and this and that and so on and so forth. So, but Doug just comes to some realizations in this film of what he should really be doing. Of how he should really be helping his wife to not only to have a happy wife, but then have a happy life. So, with that said, I think I do like Mr. Mom a little bit more than Multiplicity. Probably because I've gone on and seen Multiplicity far too often. But there is some good comedy here, but still, I've probably seen it far too often. So, I would say that Multiplicity is a solid okay film. Still a positive review. It's on Hulu currently right now, so you can check it out there. But other than that, I think I'm just going to go on and double five this bad boy up. Hopefully, I'm going to go on and remember all the bits and pieces that end up having in this movie, because I feel like dialogue is just going to go for the wayside for me. I'm just going to figure out a way to just ram through this film, because I'm getting a little bit late in the day for me. So I'm just like, bah. So here we are. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this movie. So, in the very beginning of the film, we of course have Doug, who is driving past this home that Vic is working on to re-cement this driveway. So, Doug is looking at this house and is to say to Vic, it's like, well, you know what, you guys are doing a really good job, but there is a problem with this. And Vic's like, well, what could the problem be? Like, we're working really good. And Doug mentions that it's the wrong house, it's the wrong address. And Vic seems to be a guy who is to get everything wrong or is to have some excuse, which doesn't really make sense. So we have Doug that is just so upset with Vic to the point of him stating that I'm going to go on and I'm going to do this job and the other job that we should have done. And Vic, if you go on and say a single word, I'm going to take a hammer and beat you to death with it. So Vic is like, okay, like whatever you need, whatever you want. And then he shuts up. So we have Doug who goes on to his work, to his office, which is the Dell King Construction. Come to find out, I don't know what it is about a lot of construction things that always need to have like the word like king or crown or whichever. Because of course I would work on quite a bit of like lifting equipment and stuff like that. I heaven forbid don't remember the names, like kind of forklift kind of things, and a lot of them would all be called crowns. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. So they would all have their individual goofy little names and so on and so forth. So, anyways, moving on. So Doug ends up making it to Dell King Construction, and Doug ends up meeting up with a guy named Ted, who is a coworker, and they're really kind of competing against one another because they really don't like one another. So Dell ends up telling to Doug, it's like, man, I wish that you could do work anywhere around my place because I know that you would mess it up and I would take full advantage of it. Just get free work, free labor. And we have Doug who turns around to Ted. It's like, why do you always have to pick on me? So Doug ends up getting this phone call, and so Doug ends up leaving his office, and Dell, of course, is upset by the mistake that Doug had made. And Doug is like, well, hey, I wasn't there. Vic was there. And it's like, well, yeah, but your guys were there. And so Doug was like, yeah, I get it, but still, like, it was a simple mistake. And so we have Ted that just states to Dell that there is an obvious solution to this. It's like, well, what is that? And Ted just states that they should be coming in on weekends, that they should be like putting in whatever they need to put into to make this work, that they need to even work on the holidays, that they need to go on and not have this be just a 9-to-5 job anymore. So we have Doug, after his long day of work, making his way home to realize that he needs to go on and talk to his wife about firing Vic, because Vic is just very irresponsible. So we have Laura going on and talking to somebody on the phone, and then she talks to Doug. And so Laura is to hear Doug out about firing Vic, and that Doug is to mention that he's going to have to take on even more job responsibilities. And Laura's like, well, Doug, we don't see you at home like as much anymore now, and you're going to want to do more work. And Doug is like, well, yeah, I have to. Like, I have no other thing that I can go on and do but do that. So Laura is to state that she was to go on and get a call from some prior coworker. And so Laura is to then want to go back to her realtor job. And Doug is like, yeah, how are we supposed to swing that? Like, if anything, like, Doug was being accused of missing his daughter's Girl Scout like thing, and Doug is to be like, well, like, if you and I are both working, like, no one is gonna go on and get to all of our kids' stuff. Like, we're always gonna be gone. We're never gonna be there. So we have Laura that really just wants Doug to pitch in more. And so Doug is like, well, how about you go on and just do my job? How about you just go on and you wake up at 6 in the morning and you do all the stuff that I need to do? Like, how about you do that? So all of a sudden we have Laura who starts to cry. So Doug is just like, well, like, call an exorcist. I don't know where that came from. Like, I'm sorry, honey. I realize that was a big mistake. So Doug tries to comfort Laura and tries to kiss on her. And Doug is like, we'll figure something out. And Laura's like, well, like, we don't need an exorcist, we need a miracle. So she walks off. She's ticked. Reasonably so. So Doug is to go on the next day to this next job, which is to be in the Gemini Institute. So we have Doug that immediately when going to this site is to realize there is just a bunch of people all sitting and standing around not doing their job, and Doug needs to call them on it. And we further then see that there is to be this pipe problem. This pipe had burst. And so now one of the construction workers is running to Doug stating that there is this problem. So Doug is to notice that there is to be this one guy who's kind of jerking at this pipe. And Doug is like, what are you doing? So Doug tries to fix this pipe himself, to then realize that, like, the pipe just completely bursts. And so Doug is now furious to the point of him, like, taking this pipe and smacking all these things, and he is just done. We have Mr. Leeds, or we have Dr. Leeds that goes on to notice what Doug is doing. And so we have Doug who is all of a sudden looking at all these blueprints, and like, they're like obviously heavily wet, so Doug is starting to like tear them up in his hands by accident. So we have Dr. Leeds that goes to meet up with Doug, and we have Doug that, or we have Dr. Leeds that asks Doug, like, well, hey, like, what do you do for fun? And Doug is like, fun? Like, fun, when I have fun, I go golfing. And Mr. Leeds is like, well, or Mr. Leeds, Dr. Leeds. Leeds. I'm gonna go with Leeds. That sounds better. So I won't F that up consistently. Leeds says to Doug, when was the last time you gone on and went golfing? And Doug is like, a very long time. So Leeds starts to realize that he needs to go on and figure out a way to help Doug. To really just go on and give him help. So Doug hears Leeds out and is to have Leeds mention that at one point he had cloned an atom. Then he had cloned a worm. Then he had cloned a chimp. And so on and so forth. And so Doug is like, what are you talking about here? So we have Leeds that all of a sudden we are starting to see double with this man. Because we have another Leeds that appears in front of Doug, and we then realize that Leeds had gone on to clone himself. And Doug is like, all right, like, so what are you trying to give me here? And Leeds is like, I'm trying to give you time. I'm giving you an ability to finally get to a thing that you've always ever wanted to do, which was golf, which was whatever you always wanted. Time to yourself. So Doug then is to immediately want to take Leeds up on his offer. And so here's the funny part. So Doug goes in to this unusual kind of setup for him to need to be able to clone himself. And so Doug is kind of freaking out from all this equipment. And Doug is mentioning about the fly and how he saw the fly once. And how, like, Doug was kind of freaking out about, like, the whole Jeff Goldblum thing and how he's like, and all this stuff. So we also have, like, Doug smacking himself on certain parts of the equipment. But so when Leeds ends up putting some medication to try to get Doug to fall asleep, we have Doug also stating about, like, how one of his friends was to go to this dentist appointment and he was never the same again because he was just going to for the rest of his life. So we had Leeds telling Doug to count backwards from 100, and Doug is like, that never works. And so Doug goes from back to 100, 99, and falls over. So we then get to see the Xeroxing copy of the other Doug. And so the next thing we see is a Doug that is now on this bed, waking up. And so we have Leeds that has to tell the Doug that is on this bed that he is the clone. So we have this Doug that is saying, no, like, I have every memory of my life. And so, yeah, so I'm definitely the original. And so we have Leeds that has a way to showcase to Doug that he is the second clone. And so there is to be a number on the back of his ear that states so. This big, massive 2. So, like, on the 6th day, there was some weird, goofy thing that they kind of pull away from, I think, a part of their mouth to then showcase that they are a clone. So we have Doug that realizes, like, well, I guess I am, like, the second one. And so now the original Doug goes on to ask Leeds, like, well, what do I feed it? And 2 ends up saying to Doug, it's like, well, like, what do I feed it? And Leeds is like, well, he's a normal human like you and I, so, like, treat him like a human. So, Doug, of course, is to tell 2 to kind of lay down a little bit, so that way the family doesn't see him. So, Doug decides to give 2 the guest home, the guest place. And you would think that if these people were kind of like strapped on cash, they would just be renting out that guest room. But anyways, so we have Doug who talks to 2 in his estate, like, well, hey, like, there seems to be a decent amount of clothing in here. Like, you can go through my old stuff and find something that fits you. And 2 starts looking through the things, and he's like, well, hey, like, I really like this coat. So we had Leeds that goes on to state that, like, yeah, like, 2 will go on to have all of Doug's memories, but at some point their lives will start to become separate. And we really start to find out that 2 starts to become a much more separate individual than Doug, to the point of 2 is to be more of a workaholic, but not only that, is to be a guy that really is more like he has a deeper voice than the original Doug does, because of course this kind of is to be more of a like a Beetlejuice kind of character in some ways, with the exclusion of Beetlejuice being this kind of supernatural Ash-like character. We're not going in that direction with the clone, but anyways, so we have 2 that the next day ends up going on to live Doug's work life, is to go into the job and is to start just doing all of the work. So Doug goes on to go into this job, and we have an assistant. I already mentioned Doug. It's like, well, I thought you were in the meeting already. And Doug was like, oh, like, I was already here? And she's like, well, I thought so. So we had Doug who's just like, well, yeah, like, I spilled coffee on my shirt, but you know what? Like, I like that shirt. Maybe it's kind of, maybe it's okay. Maybe I can just... So Doug is realizing that he's going to have to backpedal now because he already has a Doug that is already doing his job. So Doug then calls 2 to then try to figure out, it's like, well, hey, like, what should I do? Because of course, like, 2 has already covered all of these other side jobs, the Reseda job and all these other things. And so Doug is like, well, what should I do? And 2 is just like, I don't know, take it easy. Because of course, their main goal is they want to crush Ted. They want to really get after him because they hate that guy. So we had 2 that goes into his work and is to be very prepared and is to kind of give everybody all of these like addendums and all these things of what 2 is going to go on and try to accomplish here. So we have Dell, and we start to have Ted, who, like, Dell is to be very surprised by Doug, and Ted is to start to get very upset because it's like, oh, okay, like, I don't like what you're trying to do now. You're trying to, like, be the better of me with your go-go attitude. And so Ted goes on to just be annoyed by Doug, but he ends up going to this porta-john, and so Doug ends up taking full advantage of that by getting this forklift to pick up Ted, of course, in this porta john, which I think was kind of funny. So we then go on to have Ted start to like go and do some things that could benefit him in his family life. So we have Doug. Did I say Ted before? I meant Doug. We had Doug that is to go to his son's football game. And we all of a sudden have all of these parents that are going on to talk to Coach Jack and complain about how this guy is not doing this team correctly. And we have these guys so on and so forth, like grabbing onto this guy's whistle, and so he's like, hey, don't touch me. So we have this coach that is kind of getting very fed up by all these parents that want their kids to be played, because of course they pay X number of dollars to only have them play only X number of downs on the game. And so we have Coach Jack that is all of a sudden like pulled away from all these dads, and then is all of a sudden talking to Doug. And we have Doug at first is saying like, well, hey man, like they shouldn't be talking to you that way, because like you're just doing your best, like you're just trying to do your job. Coach Jack is like, yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. And so he's like, yeah. And then all of a sudden, we then have Doug who states like, well, like maybe you should like put a different style of ball for these kids. And we of course have the coach who tells Doug, it's like, these kids don't even know how to like do any kind of play, let alone really just have them like have the kind of play that you're wanting to go. And so then Doug goes even further to state to this coach, is like, well, if you could only put my son in. And so it's like, oh, like if you could only put in Zach. And then the coach is like, oh, who is that? It's like, oh, that's my son. It's like, no. So the coach just quits, just gives up, just walks away. So now Doug is left with this team. And he's like, all right, like, well, I guess I'll just coach this team then. So Doug then is to go on with the kids. And we have Laura that's just very surprised that Doug had the time to deal with all the kid stuff. So we have Doug that just states to Laura, it's like, well, yeah, like, you know, when before I was to talk to you about like not having enough help. So Doug lies and he mentions that he went to Dell and was to demand that he got more help, and Dell cried about it. And so Dell finally got Doug more work or more help. And so Laura's like, well, who's the guy? And Doug is like, oh, it's just some new guy. And Laura's like, well, can you trust him? And Doug is like, well, I think I can trust him with my life, which is really just because it's two, which is Doug. So Laura's like, well, okay then. Like, all right. So we... Oh, I think we also had a moment where Doug is to mention, like, the whole thing where, like, Laura states about the whole miracle thing. I think Doug was to state that he needs, like, a schedule, and Laura's like, I don't think we need a schedule, I think we need a miracle. I think it's what they actually said. So, but anyways, getting past that. So, Laura's like, well, okay, like, since Doug seems to have the ability to really go on and deal with all this family stuff, like, all right, like, so Laura is going to even more so, like, focus on her job, realizing that Doug is going to have to pick up more of the slack. So we go on to, of course, have two that goes to work, and Vic, of course, is to be an hour late. And so two is now telling Vic, it's like, well, hey, like, you do know that the job was to have you be here at 1:30. And Vic goes on, it's like, you know what, like, I'm on New York time because of this watch, and for the life of me, I just can't go on and change it. And so we have Doug, who's like, well, like, if you don't want to go on and change it, you might probably want to change your job. Because Doug goes on and fires Vic. And so Vic is like, well, wait a minute, I've only been like a couple minutes late. And Doug is like, a couple minutes late? You're 60 minutes late. It's more than a couple minutes. So Doug is to realize that Vic is going to come up with every excuse, or that this is just some weird, like, reverse psychology tactic, bizarrely. And no, like, Doug just wants Vic out of here. So Doug chucks Vic in his own truck and adjusts the truck to where it's going in reverse. And all of a sudden, one construction worker is telling Doug that this guy has like 30 some odd kids. And Doug is like, well, that's because he made the mistake of marrying so often. So, like, that's on him. So, we have Doug get this, or we have two who gets this phone call from Laura. And so Laura is reminding Doug that he needs to go on and, like, get the kids, pick them up, get them clean, get them showered, and get, of course, Jennifer ready for this picture day for her ballet. So we have now two calling Doug, who is teeing off, and we have two saying to Doug, it's like, well, hey man, like, you need to go home and you need to clean the kids and make them look presentable. And Doug is like, well, hey, I've just been, I'm teeing off here. I'm going on golf, and or I'm going on golf. I'm doing golf. I'm golfing. I'm on par 4 or whatever. So we have, of course, two who states to Doug, it's like, well, sorry, like tag, you're it. So we also had the moment where Doug goes on and bungee jumps of this huge thing, which I thought was like, wow, that's pretty crazy. That looked pretty awesome. But so we go on to, of course, have Doug, who is to run around with his daughter to force her to go and take a shower, but she wants a bath. And so we really just have Doug, who is forcing this outfit on his daughter that obviously doesn't really fit. And he's forcing her to, like, kind of fix her hair. So by the time that he has to go on and get these photos done, we have Doug that meets with this girl who is doing the ballet classes. And so he's like, okay, like, we're here for picture day. And the woman says, like, oh, I'm sorry, like, picture day is actually tomorrow. And Doug is like, do whatever you need to do to get a photographer here. Like, I had done all that, I jumped through all these hoops just for you to tell me that this photographer is not here. So, again, we have Doug, who is just really at his wits' end. So, we, after the whole photographer thing, we have Laura and we have Doug that go out on this date together at this nice restaurant where Doug orders a steak. So we have Laura that states that it feels like they're having an affair on one another. And Doug is like, well, we would have to go on, have lives for us to have an affair. So Laura and Doug are having this dinner. And all of a sudden, Doug is to start to realize that two is at this same restaurant also with Lorene. Or Noreen, my bad. Noreen. I'm sorry. So we have two that is with Noreen, and two states that, like, my wife is sleeping with another man, and uh, and this and that, and Noreen's like, oh my god, like, you know what? I thought like you would hit on me every once in a while, but I really didn't think that like we would go on this date, and that your life was just going that bad. And two is just like, yeah, like it's just not going well at all. So Noreen is like, well, do you wanna go off to my place? And two is like, sure. So all of a sudden, when both Doug and both two's eyes just kind of meet, they're like, oh crap. We're going to have some point where Laura's going to find out. So we have two that tries to adjust where he's sitting, and we start to have Doug who adjusts his menu, and we have all of a sudden that Noreen is the state that she's going to go to the bathroom, and two is mentioning about like, well, hey, like I really need some pie. Like my wife is leaving me. Like I'm losing everything. Like I just really need some pie. So, but Noreen is to leave to go to the bathroom, and so two is like, well, okay, I'll go and I'll accompany you, but I'll go into the men's room. So both Doug and both two are to meet in the men's room. And so we have this Major D that seems to really like Doug for some goofy reason. Probably because he's a little confused, because Doug has already technically been in this restaurant. I guess that's the whole why he liked him. So Doug is to go on and talk to two. It's like, well, hey, why are you here? Why are you at this restaurant? And so we have two that states it's like, well, I like meals here. Like it's my favorite place to eat. And so Doug is like, well, I get that, but still, like, why are you here? It's like, well, like again, it's the Doug's not communicating with one another, and that's where things start to fall apart. So we have Doug that is to see the Major D come into the bathroom. So Doug dunks two into the sink, and Doug then turns to Major D. It's like, well, have you ever gone on and seen somebody like helping somebody out, like clean their face before? And Major D is like, oh yeah, like all right, I'll just go to the bathroom. So two's like, what'd you do that for? And Doug is like, well, like because somebody came in. So, come to find out, we have Doug that leaves and is stating like, hey, you better leave with this woman. So, Doug all of a sudden is realizing Noreen is calling Doug over, and so Doug is like, oh crap, now I gotta play like I'm 2 and I'm not. And so we then have 2 that realizes he needs to go and now pretend that he's Doug. And so we immediately have Laura, who is to have talked to Doug, and I'll state what they had talked about. So Laura, of course, had been talking about her job, and so had Doug. Doug has stated that he's not getting any work done, and that he thinks that they should go back to the way things were, with Laura going on and doing all this stuff at home, and Doug then going back to his work fully. So Laura's like, well, you know what? Like, I think I'm making a pretty good living at my job, and it's only getting better. And like, you know what I think they should do? I think you should just give a bird. You know what I'm saying? Just taste one of these birds, these delicious birds. So Doug is like, oh my god, all right. So we then have 2 who makes his way back to Laura, was kind of emotional after that whole argument they had. So when 2 comes back, he realizes that he has no idea what he had argued with Laura about. And so he's just like, oh crap, like, I gotta figure out a way to, like, resolve this argument somehow. And so we go on to have both Noreen and we have both Doug that leaves, and for the rest of the time for them to just kind of enjoy the rest of their meal. Both 2 and Laura. So we also state that 2 was to feel lonely, and so once Doug is to meet back up with 2, 2 is to realize that Doug has an answer for that. Because 2 has gone on to decide that he is going to go on and clone himself again to create 3, which, of course, is going to kind of take care of the household kind of stuff. 3 ends up kind of becoming this, like, Martha Stewart kind of Keaton. And so I was like, okay, like, this kind of makes sense. Because, like, he is the home part of course, Doug's life. So we have these kind of, like, these certain parts of these characters that become these, like, stereo, or these kind of certain personas of what would be one person. So we seem to have 3 that comes off a little bit more, like, feminine. Like, I don't want to sound insensitive, but, like, that's just how, like, he kind of presents himself. So we have to the point where Doug now needs to put up a rule, which of course is rule 1, because it seems that there are times where there could be a close possibility that Laura could be sleeping with any of these clones. Because of course, Doug is to be going to the Laker game, and so Doug ends up calling one of the other Dougs and to see how things are going. And so by the time that he comes back home, he realizes that 3 is already in their bed. So Doug drops out of the bed, and Laura is asking 3, like, hey, what was the matter? And 3 mentions that he's like, oh, I'm sorry, I just had a nightmare. And so Laura's like, okay, like, go back to bed. So 3 and Doug go back to the the step house, or the step house. What am I thinking? The other home that now 2 is in. So I'm trying to think of the proper word for that place, the guest home. My bad. So we have Doug that has now put up the ground rule of like, well, hey, like, do not go on and do not sleep with Laura. Like, I'm the only one who goes on and does that. So I'm the original, and so yeah, like I'm the only one that's gonna sleep with Laura. So we just kind of get to a point with of course uh both 2 and 3, where they really need to go on and get to be with a female. They really need to go on and need to be with someone other than themselves. So we go on to have Doug realize that both 2 and 3 are having a party at their place. So Doug rushes over there because they're playing loud music, and 2 and 3 realize that or Doug realizes that 2 and 3 have their own women with them, and Doug is like, "Well, hey, what are you doing?" And obviously, like 2 and 3 are like, "Well, do you expect us to live like monks? Like, come on, like we like haven't been able to be intimate with anybody in I don't know how long." So Doug is like, "Well, yeah, like that's fine and all, but still, like you guys are going about this all wrong." And so Doug tries to get rid of the girls, and the girls are like, "Are you serious?" And he's like, "Yeah, like, and try to be quiet when you try to exit out of here." And so the girls end up shouting at both Lance and Rico, who Doug assumes that Rico is to actually be 2, but 2 is like, "You'd be wrong." And so come to find out 3 is Rico. So we now have Doug who's like, "Okay, like the adventures of Lance and Rico." Okay, like, so, okay, Lance, like, what were you guys trying to do? So, Lance explains, and so, come to find out, Doug is to kind of accept what they had to say. Then he realizes that there's another Doug present. And so, Doug is to just be like, "Oh, hey, hi, what?" So, come to find out there's another Doug who's Pete my wallet Doug. And so that, of course, is 4. So, 3 goes on to explain that they had gone on and went to Leeds and stated, like, okay, like, we want to clone one more Doug so that way we can have him to kind of do these kind of menial jobs like mow the lawn, or kind of do these kind of upkeeping kind of jobs that neither 2 or 3 want to do anymore. So we had 3 state that, like, they ended up cloning this clone from off of 2, and know when you would go on and do a copy of a copy, it just doesn't turn out that well. Well, that's what happened with 4. So the Leeds had a heck of a time with it. And so we finally had Doug was like, "Okay, we're stopping in the clone business, and this is our last clone, and so we're done." And so the guys are like, "Sure, fine, great." So we have Doug that is to also state that he wants to talk to 3 because he wants to completely leave to go on this sailing trip, because Doug had tried to go on and do this kind of little sailing outing, and it didn't work out because it's more like bumper cars instead of real sailing. So Doug was talking to Walt about hopefully getting a refund for him trying to be able to sail, and Walt is just like, nope. So we have Walt that mentions like, well, hey, if you really want to get out in the open, like the open sea, like you should kind of come with me and leave for a couple days. So when Doug finally gets to with Laura, we have Doug who kind of mentions this to Laura about like, well, hey, how about we just kind of leave everything and go on this boat adventure? And Laura's like, are you crazy? No, we can't do that. Like we have kids. So Doug is like, oh yeah, it was just a dream. So we go on to have Doug go on this boating trip where he kind of barfs the whole time, then realizes that like he is to have his whole life flash before his eyes, but he wasn't even in it. So Doug is to tell Three that Three is gonna have to go on and cover for him the whole entire time because he doesn't trust Two. And so also it's like, well, hey, you guys remember rule number one, and then number two, the rule number two ends up being no more clones. So Three is to mention, or Doug is to mention to Three that it's like, well, hey, like tell Laura that you're sick and you have that horrible thing that you had before, to convince Laura to like, hey, like no funny business, no intimacy. So Doug leaves, and so we have Doug that all of a sudden is to be with Laura, kind of fixing all of these like foods and whatever. And so Doug does not like how, or Three does not like how Laura is to aluminum foil one of the meats. And so he ends up doing this whole tuck tuck fold thing. And then he adjusts Laura's hair. It's like, you know what? It just like shapes you a lot better. And then Laura's like, how would you go into the room, honey? Like, how would you just leave? So we have, of course, Three that it's late at night and he falls asleep with Laura. And so we have Laura that, of course, wants to get with Three, and Three's just like, no, I'm sick. And so Laura's like, well, I think I can make you better, and she starts feeling him up. So Three immediately gives in to Laura because she's so strong. Does she work out? That's what Three tells Doug later. So we have Laura after they have lovemaking. Laura then leaves because she wants some like graham crackers and chocolate and whatever. And so Three asks, or Laura asks Three, it's like, well, hey, like, do you want anything? And Three's like, no. So Laura goes down, and so Two all of a sudden is realizing that Four has eaten everything in the guest house. And so Two is like, I'm starving. I want to go into the house. So Two goes into the house and is to then realize that Laura is in the kitchen. I think Two was also asked Four if he ate all the bologna. It's like, no, Captain Crunch. Anyways, so we have Two that goes in the kitchen, and Laura's like, oh, you've changed your mind? So Two's like, yep. So all of a sudden we find Laura seductively just licking this the spoon, and Laura is to mention how, like, hey, you remember before when we used to kind of make love all over the house? Like, whatever happened to that? So we still have two that is very hungry, is starving, and so he's coming up with all these meal ideas, these canned hams and whatever. But still, Laura, it seems, is wanting herself a little bit more of Doug, and so Doug, it seems, is to want to take this meal and run off, and then have them do it on the couch. So two and Laura kind of are supposedly walking up back to uh, the bed, and now two has to figure out a way to talk to three without Laura realizing it. So two is a scream downstairs, like, I'm sorry about the yelling, honey. Sorry about the kids. This and that. So Laura's like, don't, like, the kids are sleeping. So two is to go on and need to try to adjust Laura's windows because she left the windows down in her car. And so two gets to that. Four is to start to realize that it's thundering outside. So he comes back inside the other house to probably try to find the other ones of him. So we have three that is kind of hiding in the bathroom in the shower. So we all of a sudden, by the time four comes back, we have Laura that realizes, like, oh my god, like, you poor baby, like, you're soaked. So Laura goes in the bathroom and starting to whip off all these clothes off of four, and four is looking at three in the shower. So all of a sudden, Laura whips off four's clothes and has realized that four is a little bit excited. So four looks at three, is like, stating that Laura's like, oh my god, again, honey? So yeah, Laura is to go on and take care of it. And Doug is like, So as Laura had gone on and mentioned that the other time with two was like being on a Stairmaster. So three is to realize that they had basically, like, there goes rule one. So Doug finally, after this boat outing and this finding himself moment of barfing and puking even on Walt's dog, we really have Doug who really realizes something. So Doug goes back home and is to talk with 2, 3, and 4. So we come to find out that Doug is to lose everything by the time that Doug comes back from this journey. Because let's roll this out. So the very next day, we have two who get sick with a 100.3 temperature, and so three is to have to go on and be two at his job. The only thing is that three doesn't know what two has gone on and done in this job, so it's kind of really hard for him to figure things out. So three tries to call off from two's job, and Dell ends up yelling at three to, like, do you want me to just sell my liver? So three's like, okay, I guess I'm just gonna come in for you. How hard could it be? So come to find out, we have three that is dealing with this very harsh inspector. So we have consistently three that doesn't have an answer for a number of these issues. So he goes off to call 2, and 2 has to go on and give him the right answers. So the inspector is kind of getting annoyed for 3 needing to consistently leave to like go into a room somewhere to get these answers, and like, okay, there's something really wrong with this guy. So the inspector cannot go on and accept any of Doug's answers, and so the inspector has stated, well, hey, I'm gonna have somebody look through this house like top to bottom and like make sure all of this is right, and I'll be back here within 3 weeks. So Dell goes on and fires Doug for this mistake. And so 3 ends up calling 2 to state that he got fired. So 2 is like, you got me fired? Really? So we have 2 that comes back into the house, and Laura ends up finding 2 back in the house. And so since now that he learned that he had gotten fired, we had Laura, who was upset that 2 is not to be at work. And so 2 is like, well, hey, like, I'm sorry, but like I'm sick, and I'm just not here. And so, or I'm just like, what does he say? He's like, I'm sorry, like, do I owe you a medal or something like that for going on and giving up your whole day for me? So Laura gets upset, and so she walks off, to the point of her finding 4. And so Laura is the state, it's like, well, yeah, like, I don't really know who you are anymore, and like every time like I see different like sides view, different thing, and it's just getting me so confused. It feels like you're a lunatic. Like, just Doug, tell me what you want. Tell me what you want. And like Laura's also mentioning how like she desperately just wants Doug to like fix the house. So but Laura is really just like, tell me what you want, Doug. And Doug is like, pizza. And she's like, what? It's like, I want pizza. So Laura's like, okay, bye-bye. I'm done. I'm gonna have to go to my other family's house and just leave. So by the time that Doug comes back, we then have Doug, who has lost everything. He's lost his job, he's lost his wife, he's lost his kids. So we have now Doug, who's needing to know from every bit of all of his other clones what had happened. So we had Doug find out that he had lost his job from 2 because 3, I guess, just couldn't figure out simple things. And 3 was stating to 2, it's like, no, I was getting grilled. It was impossible. So we then go on and say, it's like, well, why is Laura not here? And 2 is like, well, that's because like I yelled at her, and 4 also talked to her too. And so 4 all of a sudden is to start to talk to Doug when Doug starts to give him more Coca-Cola. It's like, oh, you don't fix stuff. You don't fix stuff. So Doug is like, okay, like, criticism taken. So Doug is like, you know what? Like, I'm gonna go on and slap jerseys on everybody because we're gonna get this done. Like, we're gonna finally like fix this house that we've been needing to fix for a very long time. We also had the one scene where Doug goes on and he's like hassling with his kids. And he has this like pizza that he just puts this aluminum foil over and then just shoves in his fridge. But he's dealing with his kids the whole time. They're doing this like clinging with the spoons, and they're running all over the place because it's like noogies and whatever. So we turn around to have Doug work with all the other Dougs in this construction house to fix everything. And so Doug calls in Vic to just state, like, well, you know what? Like, uh, it's really just because, like, I think you are a good worker. And Vic is like, really? And Doug is like, no, like, you're just the best concrete man that I know. And, like, I need you on this job. And so Vic is like, well, do you have a team? And Doug is like, yeah. So Doug ends up showing Vic every single one of him to Vic. And so Vic is like, all right, whatever. So Vic goes on and is to do this jackhammering thing to then kind of chuck these rocks, and all of a sudden Flora goes on and like takes one simple rock, and Vic's like, what are you doing? So they get everything fixed, they get all the house fixed, everything is to seemingly be perfect. So we of course have Doug, who wants to go on and win back Laura. We also had the moment where 3 was going on and talking to Laura about the kids going to Disneyland, and then when Doug comes home, we seemingly had 3 that was a state, or we seemingly had Doug, who is very confused by the decision that I guess Laura had made. And so Doug is trying to creatively like weasel his way out of it by saying, well, Laura, like, you make good decisions. Like, I think whatever you decide is best. And Laura's like, well, they're your kids too. And Doug is like, well, I think we should leave him out of it. And Laura's like, to go to Disney World? And then Doug is like, oh, when are we going to Disney World? Christmas. Like, where did you get these tickets? They're non-refundable. No, not non-refundable tickets. And so Doug is now like frustrated about this decision, and Laura's like, well, I talked this over with you. And then Doug is like, well, not me. Like, I would have said no. So like, Doug had that whole argument with Laura, and that just leads to more frustration. That leads to Doug realizing how many mistakes that he's made throughout this whole movie. So, but Doug makes his way back to Laura, and Doug now is trying to win over Laura, and it's to state, it's like, well, hey, like, if you want to come back home, you should come back home. Like, I'm not gonna beg. Like, you're not gonna get me. Who goes on and just like, I think it's also kind of funny. Like, there's, if you remember the Batman '89 movie, where Keaton goes on and is like state about like some people go on and they come down, eat breakfast, kiss their wife goodbye, and like, it feels like we always have that explanation of some kind of dialogue for Michael Keaton that always is to kind of play out that way. And I think right around here is when we have Keaton, who goes on and does that kind of explanation, where Keaton goes on and states, it's like, well, hey, like, I get it, Laura, like, I get why you left me, I get why you did what all you did, because you did it for yourself. And like, there's a much more thorough explanation than that, but still. So Laura is to kind of be kind of non-committal to Doug, and then so Doug finally begs, and then Laura's like, no, like, don't do that. So Doug is like, just come to the house for me or with me for 5 minutes, and it'll all be worth it. So Laura goes on to see what Doug had done to the house, and it is amazing. And so Doug finally breaks down and is like, you know what, like, I'm so sorry it took me so long to do this, and like to realize like what a mistake that I've made, and so on and so. We really just have Doug, who is to really break down and figure out a real way to really win over Laura, to the point of when Laura hugs Doug, Laura's like looking at Doug like, oh my god, this guy, like, how did he do all of this? Plus, also, like, how is he this man now? So we come to find out to have 2, 3, and 4 that finally decide to just go on and leave Doug. Uh, because Doug, of course, is going to go on and do all these kind of small projects and just kind of work his way up. Maybe do some birdhouses, maybe some small carpentry things to eventually build his way back up to being able to take on bigger tasks. So, to kind of be his own entrepreneurial business, to just be on his own. So, we have Doug that goes on to state whenever there is to be a clone, how that clone is usually a handsome man or a good looking guy. So when all the clones are to tell Doug, it's like, well, hey, like we're leaving, and so Doug is like, well, here's one thing, like you're 3 really good looking guys, and so like, stop it, come on. So they end up saying their goodbyes and they end up leaving. So we have the clones drive by, and Laura is driving her car and sees all the clones, and she's like, "Oh my god, like son, you know what? The time is when you know that you really love somebody. It's when everybody just reminds you of them." And so the clone car just drives by, and so come to find out, we have a letter being sent by 3 to Doug, and come to find out all the other clones had decided to go into a pizza business called 3 Guys from Nowhere. So 3 is going on to mention how, like, 2, of course, is to really like the people there, and to the point of, like, 2 wanting to bump chests between people. We have 3 that is going on and saying that he's, like, cooking up a storm. People really love his pepperoni, and they can't get enough of it. And 3 also states that Doug will be really proud of 4, as 4 has gone on to not only do like a newspaper route, but it's also figured out a way to deliver pizzas in the same manner as the newspapers, where he goes on and takes the pizzas, just flings it at the house, like pizza. So, so really after that, we just kind of go on and wrap up this film with like Doug getting this letter. It's like, okay, great. And so everything just kind of works out. So with that said, without a doubt, I think I'm going to work my way out of here. I'm sorry for how long this video was, but usually it's how it is. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything that I forgot. There's probably a lot of details as far as dialogue that I tried to just chop through or just get through. But other than that, I think I'm going to go out of my way to get the heck out of here. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about this film. If you liked it, you hate it, if you, again, just feel whatever you want about this movie. So with that said, goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.